around and I'm different. I'm the target, I'm the one. I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm the target, I'm the one. I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm the target, I'm the one. I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm the target, I'm the one. How come they still pull me over with my light? So excuse me, officer, can I help you with my brights on? Or is my skin not white enough? And should my hands be in them cuffs? He gripped his gun and called my bluff and said, why you acting so tough? I'm different, I'm the target, I'm the one. I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm the target, I'm the one. I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm the target, I'm the one. I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm riding around and I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm the target, I'm the one. I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm the one. I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm the one. I'm riding around and I'm different. I'm the target, I'm the one. You trying to keep me a part of the system. You can't even stand inside of my sisters. You can't even stand inside of my brothers. G, my papa sign and my mothers. Long as you living with that melanin, long as you got shades of brown on your skin, people always fall as victims again. They incarcerating the women and men.
Punishment in early colonial America consisted of small towns having jails that served as prisons for runaways, people who owed money, and rebellious people. The act concerning slaves and servants was passed in Virginia, which caused prisoners to be brought to jail before they were tried. This can be seen as a form in which the flow of people into the mass incarceration system and the length of stay started to increase as early as the 1720s. After the 1776 American Revolutions, prisons were overcrowded due to the economic crisis and turmoil the nation had sustained. The first slave patrols were created in South Carolina in 1704, but had a greater impact in Virginia after the 1721 revolt. The slave patrols in Virginia were developed because slave owners and town sheriffs couldn't handle runaway slaves, and they wanted to keep control. Starting in 1738, Virginia slave patrols started visiting enslaved people's quarters and were under surveillance during holidays and other family functions. Patrollers were exempt from county and state taxes because of their services, which increased the amount of patrollers in Virginia. Young men often took the duty as patrollers, which introduced them to slave discipline and authoritative figures.
Most slave patrollers didn't have slaves of their own, but were given permission by the slave masters to practice physical discipline on slaves. They were given enough permission to where slaves would still be useful to their owners, but earned a sufficient amount of punishment. Scholars like Hayden say that the disciplining of slaves was so important that they promoted discipline through patrollers. Overall, the slave patrols were used as a mechanism to keep control of slavery by increasing the number of people surveilling slaves and ensuring that power stayed in the hands of white people. Patrolling sustained a society that regulated slaves through fear. After slave patrols came prison expansions and modernizing prison infrastructure. The Walnut Street Journal was built in Philadelphia in 1790 and was the first modern penitentiary. It was important because it set up practices such as confinement in a cell, prisoners using uniforms for later penitentiaries. We noticed a more systematic approach towards inmate lockup and coordination into incarceration systems. After the Walnut Street Journal Penitentiary, the Eastern State Penitentiary was built in 1829 and was the most expensive penitentiary in Pennsylvania of the era. This is the first time that we see an increase in federal funding and more government involvement. As a result, we see the ideology and practice of mass incarceration become a priority in the nation.
After the Civil War in the year 1865, the 13th Amendment was established. The 13th Amendment legally forbade slavery in the United States. However, there has been a loophole through the establishment of the 13th Amendment that allows slavery to continue as a punishment for crime. Consequently, rather than abolishing slavery in its entirety, the government abolished only private slavery while authorizing government-imposed slavery. Due to this, slavery has taken on much a different form through the enslavement of black individuals in the legal and prison systems. Black convicts are no longer slaves to individual masters, but rather were enslaved to private companies and businesses. This is also referred to as the convict lease system, which was initiated to save money on prison construction and later actually generated revenue. Nonetheless, this system had the intent and the effect of restricting African American freedom and demanding individuals to work in a corrupt and one of the harshest and most exploitative labor systems in American history. conflict continued after the Civil War. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were created and designed to ensure equality for recently emancipated slaves. Under the administration of President Andrew Johnson in 1865 and 1866, new Southern states passed black codes that restricted and controlled the lives of former slaves. In 1867, during Reconstruction, blacks gained a voice in government for the first time in history, winning election to Southern state legislatures and even to the U.S. Congress. In less than a decade, however, white supremacists reversed these changes brought out by Reconstruction, restoring white supremacy in the South. The Compromise of 1877 negotiated to end the contested presidential election of 1876, effectively ending the Reconstruction period due to the removal of federal troops from the South and facilitating the ascendance of Jim Crow. The failure to enact abolition democracy is what enabled mass incarceration today.
Stories of the abuse and wretched conditions of convict laborers reached the ears of many in the South. Under a pretense of progress and reform, convict leasing was abolished in Georgia in 1908, and the exploited labor force shifted from private to public works. This marked the birth of chain gangs, no better than what it was intended to replace. Prisoners worked from dawn to dusk, constructing roads, digging ditches, farming, all while chained together. Each day came to an end, and these wretched chains remained. What is that I hear? Men singing to keep the peace with one another. They can't afford to fall behind. They cannot risk being stretched on a torch rack, or tied to trees, or locked in a wooden box under the sweltering sun. This isn't a chorus you want to be a part of. They must keep the pace, or death is sure to come. Who are these men at the end of these chains? Human beings just like you and me. They are husbands, fathers, brothers, sons. They are men whose freedom were stolen. Chain gangs. Slavery by a different name.
There are two types of law, just and unjust, said Martin Luther King in a letter from Birmingham jail. Beginning in the 1950s and 70s especially, people began embodying ideas and beliefs such as MLK's to confront racial segregation and advance to passing a more egalitarian legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Events such as the Attica Prison Rebellion, Watts Rebellion, and the March on Washington were led by hundreds of thousands of marginalized civilians and freedom groups, such as the Black Panthers, who lived with the racist repercussions of an unjust government system. People were questioning the fundamentality of the fairness that lies or lacks to lie in the U.S. criminal justice system by exercising their First Amendment rights and protesting. Not only were activists critiquing the legitimacy of the law, but lawyers and criminologists were questioning the efficacy of prison and harsh punishment. In order to alleviate the issues of racial and economic inequities in this time, President Lyndon B. Johnson implemented his Great Society program.
Among this initiative, due to the overwhelming poverty rate of 19%, Johnson declared a war on poverty, which sought to eradicate the problems plaguing urban communities. In order to do this, he passed laws such as the Law Enforcement Assistance Act to modernize law enforcement, which flooded justice departments with hundreds of billions of dollars. In the words of Elizabeth Hinton, the result was a significant expansion of America's carceral state. Although his goal was to expand supervision and control low-income urban communities, it eventually imploded due to misconceptions about urban communities made by the policymakers. The program called for the construction of many new prisons, and in order to fill these prisons, they increased surveillance, improved technology, and put more cops on the ground. In turn, this led to an abundance of unqualified cops coming from predominantly white suburban areas with predisposition thoughts about minorities patrolling the streets of inner cities. This caused an even bigger rift between cops and minorities, ending with hundreds of thousands of primarily Black and Latino civilians to be thrown into jails and prisons unjustly, beginning America's exponential increase in prison population.
We demand an immediate end to the war on Black people. This statement is one of the many reasonable demands listed on the platform for the Movement for Black Lives. This movement, and movements like this, such as Mothers Reclaiming Our Children and Families Against Mandatory Minimums, are the direct result of the disadvantaged people of color, especially Black people, face against the criminal justice system. The Movement for Black Lives focuses on more than just police brutality and criminal injustice. They strive to advance Black people and other people of color through economic justice, political power, community control, and other platforms.
Because there is an important link between unemployment, poverty, and incarceration, the economic justice platform on the Movement for Black Lives is imperative. This platform demands federal support in reconstructing the economy to make room for Black ownership. The Movement for Black Lives demands an end to the criminalization of Black political activity, including the end of the disenfranchisement of Black voters through incarceration. Spreading the knowledge of mass incarceration is just one of the many ways the Movement for Black Lives wants to end the war against Black people. The unjust indictments and fatal shootings of minorities has taken the media by storm, with people commenting and speaking out on the injustice and lack of equal rights within America. There are so many legislative policies against Black people in the judicial system, Congress, and even leaders in their own communities. It is a monstrous problem to contain and limit Black people to this sort of degradation. The Movement for Black Lives aims to terminate all inequities and vices against Black people, Black families, and Black futures.
50 years ago, President Lyndon B. Johnson declared the war on crime, which brought forth a new era of a more vicious American law enforcement. In 1968, President Johnson presented the Law Enforcement Assistance Act to Congress, which established a role for the federal government in state and local police operations, court systems, and prisons. With federal support, local police officers began to crack down on crime in so-called high-impact neighborhoods. These neighborhoods were usually urban cities with high Black populations. Millions of African Americans and other minorities were highly targeted by these officers and were discriminated against by the system. The idea of innocence until proven guilty evidently didn't apply to them because Blacks and Latinos were often criminalized before their case had proven so. In 1970, the legislation introduced a new plane of punitive policy. Mandatory minimum sentences of 5 years for anyone with a second armed offense, and also gave life in prison to those who committed a third. This idea of 3 strikes dramatically increased the population of the prison system. The obsession with law and order and the media criminalization of Black males created fear within the American society and justified the harsh treatment that Black groups received from police forces.
And federalism, the term that is most generally connected to the Nixon administration. This is a system in which powers are divided up between the states and the national government. The Constitution divides these powers up and assigns certain powers to each level of government. New federalism held that the U.S. was becoming too unitary. It held that states should have more power than they did at the time. Perhaps the clearest example of new federalism is the trend in which states have more say over how they run their welfare programs. For example, have rules on things like welfare or environmental protection that were very dissimilar. This would mean that Americans in different states would live under very different governmental systems. Giving authority back to the states, with reduced funding from the federal government in the form of block grants, seems most likely to have the effect of reducing the total amount of money being spent on the poor. In doing so, this makes our country less unified. In making our country less unified, only makes the poor suffer and the rich happy.
A block grant is a grant from a central government that a local authority can allocate to a wide range of services. The Business Insider reveals the relaxed truth in sentencing laws. Today, over 35 states require offenders to serve 85% of their prison sentence regardless of the potential fitness for early release. This is excessive and arbitrary. Federal truth in sentencing guidance lines emerged in the mid-90s as a way to insensitize tougher crime policies on a state-by-state basis. States that resisted the 85% standard became ineligible from receiving federal block grants authorized by the Violent Crime and Law Enforcement Act of 1994.